Linux is a great operating system. You get control, privacy, stability, and the ability to customize almost everything to your heart's content. And honestly, that part is amazing. And while I do enjoy pressing Linux on this channel, it's not perfect. Unlike Windows 11, which somehow manages to get worse every other update, while Microsoft pretends everything is fine, Linux has its own set of frustrations. These are not deal breakers, just things that even experienced users and sometimes beginners absolutely hate. So today, here are 10 things Linux users hate, but still deal with anyway. Before we start, I want to be very clear. This isn't a rant, and it's not meant to scare anyone away from Linux. I use Linux every day and I like it. But if you have used it for a while, you know there are moments where you just sigh and say, yep, that's Linux. Talking honestly about these things actually helps people stick with Linux instead of giving up over something they think is their fault. So starting at number 9 is waiting for features to mature. One thing Linux users really hate, but still deal with, is waiting. Linux often has great ideas and very solid foundations. The problem is that some features take a long time to fully arrive or work consistently. A good example is HDR support. On Windows, HDR for games and media has been around for years. On Linux, it depends on your desktop environment, your compositor, your GPU, your monitor, and sometimes the phase of the GNU. Another example is HDMI 2.1. Even if you have a modern GPU and a fancy TV or monitor, some advanced features like high refresh rates or certain HDR modes don't work smoothly yet. It usually gets there eventually. Linux users don't hate the progress. They just hate the waiting and not knowing when everything will finally be done. Number 8. Explaining Linux to non-Linux users. If you use Linux, you have probably heard these questions.
Why Linux? Why not Windows? Why do you use the terminal? Is Linux hard? Can you play games on it? Will my software work? Is Linux only for advanced users? Do you really need IT background to use it?
At first, you answer patiently. Then you answer briefly. Eventually, you just say,
It just works for me.
Linux users don't hate questions. They just don't want to be full-time evangelists explaining their OS choice at every family dinner. Number 7, which is similar to number 6, it's the "it always works on my machine" sentence. So let me set up a situation for you. Let's say you ask for help. Something breaks, a game crashes, a driver fails, or an update causes issues. And the response you get is,
It works on my machine.
now, that answer usually isn't meant to be rude. Most of the time, the person is just saying they don't have the same issue. But that doesn't help. Linux systems vary a lot. Different distros, different kernels, different drivers, different hardware, and even different desktop environments. So something working on one system and failing on another is completely normal. That's why the "it works on my machine" feels like a dead end. What actually helps are questions like, what distro are you using? What kernel version? What GPU? Can you share logs? And naturally, Linux users learn to deal with this, but still annoying to deal with. Number 6. Documentation that assumes you already know everything. Linux documentation can be fantastic, but sometimes it assumes you already understand things beginners don't. Let's say you follow a guide like this one, and suddenly it says, edit this config file and rebuild the init ramfs. To an experienced Linux user, this basically means edit one file, run one command, and reboot. To a beginner, it sounds like, if I mess this up, my PC will explode. Again, to new users, it sounds like you're being asked to perform a surgery on your operating system. But over time, Linux users learn what these steps actually mean. But at the beginning, the documentation can feel way more intimidating than it needs to be. Number 5. Inconsistent app design. Some Linux apps look clean and perfectly integrated, as they should be, but others look like they belong to a completely different desktop, even though you're using the same environment. That's because Linux apps use different toolkits like GTK, Qt, or Electron, and not all of them follow the same design rules. Nothing is broken, it just makes the desktop feel less consistent than it could be. Some Linux apps look clean and polished, others look like they escaped from a different operating system entirely. Menus are different, themes don't match, and sometimes settings are in strange places. Linux users get used to it, but they definitely notice, and it is always something to brag about. Number 4. Fragmentation is everywhere. Linux users love freedom until they have to explain it. We have different distros, different desktop environments, different package managers, Snap, Flatpak, App Image, sometimes even different audio systems. For experienced users, this is normal. You pick what you like, ignore the rest, and you move on with your life. But for newcomers, it can feel overwhelming. You just wanted to install Linux, and suddenly you're choosing between Ubuntu, Fedora, Arch, Mint, OpenSUSE, and about 200 other distributions that you probably never heard about. Do you think I, a Linux user, know all of these distributions? Of course not. I don't know any of these distributions. I only know the ones that are still being maintained up to this day. It's kind of like building a PC. Just like choosing a CPU, you wouldn't randomly pick one without thinking about compatibility, budget, and what you actually need. You choose something that fits your use case and that you are comfortable working with. Linux distributions are the same. It's important to pick one that matches your comfort level and take your time during the installation. Once that decision is made, things usually become much simpler. So the problem here isn't that Linux has options. Options are good. The problem is being introduced to all of them at once without context. So Linux users don't hate freedom, they just hate explaining why there are 14 ways to install the same calculator app. And after a while, most people just say,
Use whatever your distro recommends, you'll be fine.
Number 3, and I think this deserves to be quite high on this list. Let's talk about NVIDIA drivers. Now, to be fair, NVIDIA drivers on Linux have improved a lot over the years. Wayland support is much better than it used to be. Performance is better, installation is smoother on many distros, and NVIDIA has even released open source kernel modules. So yes, things are moving in the right direction. But here's the part Linux users still hate. The experience isn't the same for everyone. And as I've said multiple times, it depends on your distro, it depends on your GPU generation, it depends on your kernel version, and sometimes it even depends on whether you updated 5 minutes ago. Some distros like Pop! OS make it easy by defaulting to the proprietary drivers. Others require a bit more manual setup. Arch-based systems might need you to know exactly which package you need. Then there's the classic question, do you use the proprietary driver? Do you use Nouveau? Are you on a legacy GPU that only supports older driver versions? And if you've ever had a driver update break something that worked perfectly yesterday, you know the feeling. So Linux users don't hate NVIDIA. They just hate having to think about GPU drivers more than they would like to. On Windows, most people install a driver and they forget about it. On Linux, sometimes you install a driver and then remember it forever. Again, it's not a deal breaker. It's just one of those areas where Linux requires a bit more awareness and sometimes patience. Number 2, hardware support roulette. Most of the time, Linux installs perfectly fine. You boot into the live USB, everything works, and within 20 minutes, you are sitting at your desktop wondering why you didn't switch earlier. But sometimes you reboot after installation, and suddenly, no Wi-Fi, no sound, your fingerprint reader doesn't exist, or your secondary monitor decides to no longer believes in HDMI. The frustrating part isn't that these problems are impossible to fix, it's that the solution depends entirely on your exact hardware, your Wi-Fi chip, your GPU, your motherboard, and sometimes even the specific laptop revision. Two people can have the same model name and still have slightly different components inside. So Linux users learn the routine, test the live USB first, search your laptop or motherboard model online, install additional firmware packages if needed, reboot, and maybe reboot again. Most of the time it works, but the initial uncertainty, that moment where you don't know whether it's a quick fix or a 3-hour troubleshooting session, that's what users really dislike. It's not that Linux doesn't support hardware, it's that hardware support sometimes feels like opening a mystery box. Usually it's fine, but sometimes it's an adventure. Finally, number 1, as a Linux user, do you mainly drive Wayland or X11? If you have ever been using Linux for a while, you have definitely heard this debate. Wayland is supposed to be the future. It's more secure, more modern, and designed to fix a lot of the architectural problems that X11 has carried around since basically forever. And to be fair, Wayland has improved a lot. On many systems, it works perfectly fine for everyday use. Performance is good, input feels smoother, and security is better. But then you try to do something slightly specific. For example, maybe you want to screen record, maybe you want to use a game overlay, or maybe you want to run an older application that hasn't fully adapted yet, and suddenly something doesn't work the way you expect. So what do people do? They log out and switch back to X11 and carry on with the rest of their day. X11 is old, everyone knows that. It's not as secure and it has its own design limitations, but it's predictable. And when something works on X11 but not on Wayland, practicality usually wins. Linux users don't hate Wayland, and they certainly don't hate X11 either. What they hate is the awkward in-between phase, where Wayland is almost ready everywhere, but not quite everywhere. This is why I asked you the question if you mainly drive Wayland or X11. So for now, many users just keep both sessions installed and treat them like two different tools. Wayland for modern use, and X11 for just in case if X doesn't work on Wayland. It's just one of those uniquely Linux situations where progress is happening, but the transition takes time. And until that transition is fully complete, users will keep switching back and forth and thinking, this is still a damn thing. And before we wrap things up, I did say 10 things. So here's a bonus one. Since I talked about hardware roulette, let's talk about Linux audio roulette. More specifically, audio devices switching themselves. Let's say you plug in your headphones and there's no sound. You unplug HDMI, but your monitor is still somehow the default output. Bluetooth connects successfully, but the sound is coming from a device you didn't even know existed. So you open your settings, sound, output, and suddenly you're looking at 7 different devices, or maybe even more, and something called Pro Audio that sounds way more serious than you remember installing. To be fair, Pipewire has improved Linux audio a lot, but every now and then Linux just decides your sound should come from somewhere else. Again, it's not broken, it's just audio roulette, similar to hardware roulette. And if you've ever clicked through every output device thinking, where's my sound? You know exactly what I mean. So what do you guys think? Are there any frustrations I missed in this video? Write them down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. It's your boy Jury, and I'll be seeing you in the next video. Take care, and I'm signing out.